and this is a debut presentation that I've never given before. And I really just am appreciative of Don and the organizing committee for inviting me and giving me a chance to get weird a little bit and approach a talk not so much presenting, but more provoking. And so maybe consider it coming from a place of frustration or maybe a place of just optimism and possibility. But really, one of the things that this is born out of is one of my mentors in the human-centered design realm. It has really helped me lean into is this notion of recognizing our assumptions. That so often we have opportunities to step back and realize, oh, we've made an assumption here we didn't even realize we were making. And so that's really the basis of this talk. And another way of thinking about it is decisions that are made that were never actually decided. So for example, I am not gonna go shopping for my nieces and nephews in Vienna because I came here with a fully packed suitcase. So I made a decision that was never actually decided. I only realized once I was here. Right? But these also are more impactful when we think about things. When I was in high school and played sports, I was the only Jewish kid in the history of my school district. And every year they would schedule sports competitions on Yom Kippur. And there was no decision to exclude me, but I was excluded. So diving into just some assumptions, that just opportunities for us to recognize assumptions that we're making. A really big one is just why? Why the heck are we even doing this? And I think that there's just, a lot of times we take it for granted that, yeah, we know why, but like, are we writing it down? Are we actually discussing that with one another? Are all the people in the room in agreement about why we're doing this? And you know, I was trying to think, what's a good accessible example of this? And I thought about football. And I was actually thinking about the Simpsons episode of football, if you're familiar with that, where it just makes no sense to Homer, but you know, there's a different why, right? Like the athletes, for them, it might be about winning, right? For an official, it might be about fairness and ensuring justice in the sport. For some of the people in the stands, it might be about nationalism or a family experience or gambling. And for all of these different stakeholders and all of these different motivating factors, there's a different why. And so when we start, if we can actually state our assumptions and validate those assumptions, then you know we can hopefully help ourselves make decisions that stay made. One just shout out to the We Are Opens group. They have a badge, an evolution of the badge canvas called the Badge Bloom remix tool that is really great tool to help with this in design facilitation. I think another great question to ask ourselves that we've heard a little bit about from some of these other presenters is who cares, right? That we might, you know, have learners who might raise their hand and say, why should I care about your stupid badge? And in a lot of cases, if our response is because you should be intrinsically motivated to learn, that's just not a very good value proposition. And so, you know, let's actually not just assume that they want this, but validate our assumptions that go into that. Another question that, you know, we don't ask until too late often is who's missing, right? And that shows up oftentimes in ways that are, you know, harmful, that perpetuate historical inequities, right? That if I don't want to tread too much on where Ashley Proctor and her presentation is going to be going, but you know, there's just so many opportunities for us to exclude people by not intentionally including them. And so if on the front end, we're asking ourselves, who's not at the table? And this goes beyond just who we're serving on the learners, but also just on our design teams, right? I just became aware of a technology implementation that was a humongous lift, very expensive, and day one, they found out that oh no, there's a character limit on names. And guess who's disproportionately impacted on really long names? Right? And so by not having somebody from the technical team at the table to ask some of these basic functionality requirement questions, we made decisions without ever having decided. And unfortunately, they're ones that serve to exclude people rather than include them. Another thing that is just a huge pet peeve of mine is asking ourselves what counts. And I think that there's just, I guess, two things that really go into this. And one is that there's a lot of power in deciding what counts. Because when we do that, we are also implicitly deciding what does not count. And a great example of that that I learned from Ashley, who I mentioned a moment ago, it was working with midwifery practices with indigenous populations. And just realizing that at the local teaching university, that body of knowledge, thousands of years old, not counted. Which means that, that there's just this huge amount of power that also, if we go back to the previous slide of who's missing, if we have representation, we have the opportunity to recognize what counts and be more inclusive and avoid making those exclusionary decisions. Sorry, just watching my time. And the second thing that I want to discuss on what counts is, an opportunity to be creative. That Don Prezan actually had a really interesting post on LinkedIn recently where he was talking about, that it's interesting that the default in professional associations for educators, when we talk about professional learning and continuing education, the default is to trainings. Attend a training, get credit for your professional learning. At the same time, has anyone in here ever been an educator? And did anybody in here learn something outside of a training that helped make you a better educator? Maybe just reading a conversation with another person, observing a colleague in their classroom, reading an article in Fast Company that somehow had nothing to do with education, but everything to do with teaching and learning. And that there's opportunity for us to get creative when we're more open-minded about what counts, and have opportunities with open recognition to notice, name, and credential that in ways that helps recognize assets and open doors. Another thing that I think is coming along are questions about quality. And I think there's really valid and essential reasons to measure quality. Especially we have people who are earning credentials that were not free. And maybe they're going into debt for these, maybe they're taking out loans, and it is important for that for the loan providers that this is they're lending their money for quality learning, and one of the defaults that I'm observing in North America is the number one measure of quality is increased earning outcomes for learners. And I think that is a very valuable metric for us to be paying attention to. And I think that there's a lot of valuable credentials that could be mismeasured and mislabeled as low quality. For example, early childhood educators. Their high quality credentials are not going to increase in higher earnings. And in a field that is disproportionately led by females of color, we are all of a sudden, potentially creating credential measurements that disempower and disenfranchise the very people who we most want to serve. And, another thing as we think about the opportunities of what counts is also to consider just what's missing. And, the one example that I wanted to share with that was a project we were doing some design thinking in elementary school where they were talking about, to decide the makeup of our 3 third grade classrooms, our 3 second grade classroom teachers get together and they formulate lists. And the way they'd make those class lists is oftentimes by kind of jumbling all the names and being like, ooh, too many talkers over here, let's rebalance. Too many runners, and looking at deficit-minded behaviors to make sure they weren't, weighting certain classrooms with things that were going to stress the teachers out, frankly. But at the same time, there's opportunity for us with open recognition to pay attention to things such as, who are our handholders? Who are people who bring cards on Valentine's Day? Who remembers birthdays? Who, instead of always answering a question, asks another student a question or to bring them into the conversation? And they realized that through that, they were still able to have well-balanced classrooms, but based off of students' assets, just by being creative of, a missing opportunity for recognition. Another example that I'll give that goes back nearly 100 years in the United States is minimum wage. That it was not something that was legislated. It was essentially, an open recognition opportunity where they said, shop owners, if you paid this minimum wage, we will give you a sticker to put in your window. And then maybe people, when they're deciding if I'm going to buy my bread here or here, I'm going to go to the one with the sticker in the window because I know that the people behind the counter are being paid fairly. Right? And so when we think about missing opportunities for credentialing, I think one of the really big spaces for us to get weird and hopefully impactful is not just thinking about who we can be credentialing, but what we can be credentialing when we think about organizations. And I think to the conference theme of a more sustainable planet, think about recycling practices. Right? What if there's just geolocated maps like our colleagues here in Europe with the Navigator platform, where you could, if you want to see great examples of high quality recycling practices, you can see on a map where your neighbors who've been credentialed are and can go learn from them. Another quick question, and I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to go really fast here, is just who disagrees? Because if it's nobody, that's probably a sign that there's somebody missing, right? I think standards are really important. It makes sense to me, especially technology standards. And I think that one of the assumptions, a decision that is sometimes being made without ever having been decided, is what do we actually mean about standards? Like, are we sometimes, when we calling for standards, is there a disconnect where what we're really seeking is just shared meaning making? Right? Like, so for example, I go back to the same image, there are people in this room who might call this stuff pitch, whereas I'd call it grass. Someone else might call it a field. And between the three of us, there is no meaning lost. We're all gonna be able to get along and not have any slowdown in the progress of our conversation. And so that's, in my mind, an example of an opportunity for just seeking shared meaning. It's not necessarily anything. It would be a misstep, I think, for us to say, before we can go on with playing this game, we need to standardize what we're going to call this stuff. And finally, I really am just inspired by asking ourselves the question, what if we're wrong? Most predictions are, especially mine. I thought that by 2018, we would be able to go in the United States in American football. They show there's first down marker on TV. It's a yellow line. I predicted that by 2018, you'd be going to the games and on my glasses, I'd be able to see the yellow line projected in AR on the field. Totally wrong about that. It's 2023. We still don't have that. Like, most of our predictions are going to be wrong. And yet, I think one of the assumptions we make is that we're going to be right, and so what if we step back and ask ourselves, what if we're wrong? What does that mean? What are the impacts? What are the opportunities for us to stumble on this? And finally, I just want to close with not just a provocation, but a challenge to just ask ourselves, if not us, if we look at something and we say, that's not our job, if not us, then who? Right? Are we leaving it to other people, other organizations who we would much rather not see leading those decisions and those conversations? And so my challenge to us is just to ask ourselves, in moments where we're tired, we're exhausted, we've been carrying this burden for over a decade in some cases, to just remind ourselves, if we don't do this, then who will? Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.
So, thanks very much, Noah. I think you should take that one on the road. Road tested, okay? So really good. While we set up for Jason, we'll take one or two questions. Patrice, can you help with the microphone? Just take the mic. Oh, sorry. Any question?
No, I'm kind of curious. Have you answered these questions for yourself?
Mostly not. Do as I say, not as I do. I think that one of the traps of this stuff is that it's so hard. To constantly just hold yourself accountable, to take a step back and ask yourself, what assumptions are we making right now? What are the decisions that we might be making without actively deciding on them? And I think that as a rule, like probably never going to get to a majority of those things, no matter how much we try. At least this highly flawed human probably won't. But I do the best I can.
Well, I just meant in terms of if not us, right? Who else could actually be at the table?
Oh, do you know that last question? If not us, then who is? I guess I was more taking it to a place of, like, do we want Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos to be making these decisions for us? Is where I was going with that provocation.
I know the answer to that one. Okay. So thanks very much, Noah. That was a wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking.